Nobody talks about this. Not openly anyway. Everyone wants to know about Amish relationships, but they're scared to ask the real questions. How do people who grow up without movies, without romance novels, without sex education, without any of the tools the modern world uses to understand intimacy, how do they figure it out? I'm Sarah. I left the Amish community in Pennsylvania 4 years ago, and today I'm going to tell you exactly how intimacy works in Amish psychology. The real version, not the sanitized tourist version, not the romance novel version, the complicated, messy, beautiful, and sometimes heartbreaking truth. Let's start with something most people don't understand. Intimacy in the Amish world isn't just about physical closeness. In fact, it's mostly not about that at all. When you grow up Amish, you're taught from childhood that your worth isn't in your individual desires or feelings. It's in your ability to contribute to the community, to fit into God's plan, to serve your family and church. So emotional intimacy doesn't develop the way it does in the outside world. You don't sit around having deep conversations about your feelings. You don't talk about your dreams and fears and insecurities. That's considered self-centered, maybe even prideful. Instead, intimacy is built through shared purpose, through working together, through unspoken understanding. I'll give you an example. My parents were married for 32 years before my mother passed. I never once saw them kiss in public. I rarely saw them hold hands. They didn't say, "I love you." But they had this rhythm, this silent communication, where my father would look at my mother across the room and she'd know exactly what he needed. She'd hand him his hat before he even asked. He'd bring her water before she said she was thirsty. That was their intimacy, built over decades of shared labor, shared faith, shared meals, shared silence. Now let's talk about the part everyone's curious about, physical intimacy. The official teaching is crystal clear. No sex before marriage, period. Sex is for procreation within the bounds of marriage. That's what you're taught. That's what the church preaches. But here's what nobody outside the community understands. The reality is way more complicated. In many Amish communities, especially the more traditional ones, there's a practice called bed courtship or bundling. Yes, you heard that right. An unmarried young man would come to a girl's house at night, go up to her bedroom, and they'd spend the night together in her bed, fully clothed usually, sometimes with a board down the middle of the bed. Sometimes the girl would be wrapped in a special blanket that made it impossible to do anything physical. The idea was that you'd lie there all night talking, getting to know each other deeply, building emotional intimacy without crossing physical boundaries, developing self-discipline. Did it always work that way? Absolutely not. I knew plenty of girls who got pregnant before marriage. When that happened, there'd be a rush to get them baptized and married before the pregnancy showed. The church leaders would accelerate the process so you could become a member in half the usual time. Then you'd get married quickly, before anyone could count backward from the baby's birth date. And if you'd had sex before marriage, you'd have to confess publicly to the church before you could get married. Stand up in front of everyone and admit your sin. The shame of that kept a lot of couples from confessing even when they should have. Here's the psychological part that's really interesting. Because physical intimacy was so restricted, so forbidden, it became this huge source of anxiety and confusion. You had no sex education. None. Amish schools don't teach it. Parents don't talk about it. You learned bits and pieces from watching animals on the farm, from whispered conversations with friends, from piecing together fragments of information. So by the time you got married, you had this weird mix of intense curiosity, deep shame, and absolutely no practical knowledge. I remember my wedding night. I was 20 years old. I'd kissed my husband a few times during our courtship, and that was it. We'd never talked about sex. We'd never discussed what we wanted or expected. And suddenly we're married, and it's supposed to just happen naturally. The psychological pressure was enormous. You're taught your whole life that sex is wrong, sinful, something to avoid and feel guilty about. And then you get married, and suddenly it's supposed to be beautiful and right and natural. That switch doesn't just flip overnight. A lot of Amish couples struggle with intimacy in the early years of marriage because of this, the women especially. You've been conditioned to feel shame about your body, about desire, about pleasure. You've been taught that physical intimacy is for procreation, not enjoyment. So when you're supposed to suddenly be intimate with your husband, there's this internal conflict. Is it okay to enjoy it? Is it sinful to want it? What if I'm doing it wrong? But you can't talk about these things. Not with your mother, not with friends. Definitely not with your husband. The psychological model for Amish intimacy is based on duty, not desire. A wife's role is to submit to her husband, to be available when he wants physical intimacy, to bear children. It's a transaction of sorts. He provides, she submits, he leads, she follows. That's the framework. And within that framework, personal desires, especially a woman's desires, don't really have space to exist. Now, before everyone gets upset, I need to say this. Not every Amish marriage is like that. I knew couples who genuinely loved each other, who found ways to build real intimacy despite the limitations. My aunt and uncle had this beautiful relationship where you could see the affection in the way they looked at each other, the way they moved around each other in the kitchen. They found intimacy in small gestures, in private moments, in the life they built together. But the system isn't set up to create that. The system is set up to create functional partnerships that produce children and maintain the community. Emotional intimacy, if it happens, is a bonus. Physical pleasure, especially for women, is not considered important. Your worth as a wife is measured by how many children you have, how well you run your household, how obediently you follow your husband's leadership. Here's something else people don't understand. Affection in public is absolutely forbidden, even after marriage. You don't hold hands, you don't hug, you don't kiss. That's considered immodest, inappropriate. Intimacy is supposed to be completely private. So couples develop this very compartmentalized approach. In public, you maintain strict boundaries. You're formal with each other. You don't show emotion. Then in private, supposedly, you're intimate. But that split, that constant switching between public formality and private intimacy, it messes with your head. It makes it hard to integrate those two parts of yourself. And let's talk about consent, because this is where things get really uncomfortable. In the Amish worldview, once you're married, there's no such thing as saying no to your husband. Marital rape isn't recognized as a concept. If your husband wants physical intimacy, it's your duty to comply. You're taught that from childhood. A good wife doesn't refuse. A good wife doesn't complain. A good wife submits. I knew women who were deeply unhappy with their physical relationships, women who dreaded nighttime, women who felt used and violated but had no framework to understand what was happening to them because they'd been taught this was normal, this was their role, and they couldn't leave. Divorce doesn't exist in the Amish church. You're married for life. So if your husband is demanding, if he's rough, if he ignores your needs and feelings, you're stuck. The psychological impact of this is massive. You develop this disconnect from your own body. You learn to endure rather than enjoy. You learn to disappear mentally during physical intimacy. Some women I knew would just lie there and pray until it was over. That was their coping mechanism. But here's what's interesting. Despite all of this, despite the lack of education and the shame and the duty-based framework, many Amish couples do develop genuine intimacy over time. They learn each other's bodies. They figure out what works. They build trust and affection through years of shared life. It's not the passionate romance you see in movies. It's quieter, steadier, but it's real. And there's something about the shared values, the shared faith, the shared commitment to making the marriage work no matter what, that creates its own kind of intimacy. You're in this together. You're building a life, raising children, farming the land, serving the church. That shared purpose creates a bond that's different from romantic love, but equally powerful in its own way. The men, by the way, have their own struggles with intimacy. They're taught to be stoic, unemotional, strong. They're not allowed to be vulnerable. They're not allowed to ask for emotional support. So they often don't know how to express affection, how to be tender, how to connect on an emotional level. They default to providing materially and expecting submission in return. That's the only model they've ever seen. I've talked to ex-Amish men who said they had no idea how to be in a real relationship after they left. They didn't know how to communicate feelings, how to negotiate desires, how to treat a woman as an equal partner. They had to completely relearn what intimacy meant. For me, leaving the Amish and learning about intimacy in the outside world was like discovering a language I didn't know existed. The idea that I could say no, the idea that my pleasure mattered, the idea that I could talk openly about what I wanted and needed. That was revolutionary. It took years to undo the programming, to stop feeling guilty about desire, to stop defaulting to submission. So when people ask how intimacy works in Amish relationship psychology, the answer is complicated. It's built on duty and shared purpose rather than desire and emotional connection. It's constrained by shame and secrecy rather than openness and education. It's shaped by rigid gender roles and biblical submission rather than equality and mutual respect. But within those constraints, real love does sometimes bloom. Real intimacy does sometimes develop. It's just a very different path to get there. The Amish aren't monsters. They're not evil. They're people trying to live according to what they believe is God's will. But the system they've created around intimacy causes real psychological harm. It creates women who don't know they have the right to say no. It creates men who don't know how to be emotionally present. It creates couples who stay together out of obligation rather than love. And here's the final thing I want you to understand. When you grow up in that system, you don't realize how different it is. You think everyone lives this way. You think this is normal. It's only when you leave, when you see how relationships work in the outside world, that you realize what you were missing: the freedom to choose, the freedom to explore, the freedom to say this isn't working and walk away, the freedom to build intimacy on your own terms rather than following a script written centuries ago. I don't regret my Amish upbringing entirely. It taught me discipline, hard work, faith, but when it comes to intimacy, I had to unlearn almost everything I was taught. And I'm still learning, still figuring out what healthy intimacy looks like, still working through the shame and guilt and confusion. That's the real cost of the Amish approach to relationships. Not just what you're taught, but what you have to undo afterward.